It's time for the panel discussion, so we ask the panel to take the seats. So we reach the panel discussion. And now it's time for me to introduce to you. We start with Mr. John Heino. And we are very happy to have you here. You traveled from Finland. You are very active in SIFI as one of the members on the advisory board. And you are a senior specialist and a former assistant director general and the head of the forestry department of the FAO. And you are currently as well the chair of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee for a legally binding agreement on forests in Europe. Very welcome.
Thank you.
And then we have Ambassador Lennart Båge. He's an expert on development projects in rural livelihoods. He was formerly the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, and has currently board positions at SLU and Sida, and is also a member of the advisory board of SIFI. Welcome. And then we have Agronomist Ola Miller. He has introduced himself here, but he's a senior policy specialist with the responsibilities for agroforestry, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, food security, and rural development. He has 20 years of working experience from Sida. And then we also have, so very welcome. And from before, you know Liz, you know Mia and Björn. So I will start by asking a couple of questions to these ladies and gentlemen, and then I will open the floor for the audience. And the first question at hand is what you think. I would like you to very fast give a short answer about what you think about the development regarding the landscape approach. If you believe that it will progress as an ideology, or that it will in the near future develop specific tools for implementing and monitoring. And I would like to have short comments and would like to start with Jan, please.
Thank you very much. I tend to be conservative a little bit and cautious, and having listened to colleagues today, I would vote for the first alternative because of the review still going on, the research that has to be done. So I think it will take some time, and also all my experience from international processes tend to tell me that. So that would not, of course, exclude taking steps forward regarding creating new tools at the same time. But if these are the two alternatives, I'm afraid we still have to use some patience in going forward with the landscape approach. That would be my short answer.
Thank you for this. What is Liz's opinion about this?
I actually agree with both components of your question, Frederick. I think that the framework will continue to evolve as we move into the future, but at the same time we also need to think more about the tools and measures that we're able to implement to measure effectiveness of the landscape approaches, which in turn will allow more progression of the theoretical framework of the landscape approach.
And this is a typical answer by a researcher. But if you would like to choose, what is your belief in the future? Do you think it will be strong, specific tools that will be very useful for monitoring in 10 years' time, as you say? And
yes,
so on?
yeah, I think that should, the
So
emphasis should be placed on there.
Very interesting. Okay. And now I would like to ask Mia about her opinion about this.
Thank you. And well, if the researcher answer is both working in the government, for sure, it's also a little bit of both. But having said that, I think this year we have a golden opportunity to actually move forward quite quickly on the landscape approach, if that is what we would like to see. This year is an important year in the global context, in the sense that we are now developing sustainable development goals, which will frame a lot of the policy thinking for the next, until 2030, because that's really the time frame for the SDGs. And I think, the Secretary General has already, for the UN, has already identified the landscape approach as a valuable, transformative tool to implement the SDGs. So if we are moving in that direction, for sure, I think we will also be moving in the direction of developing more monitoring tools, etc. However, since you listened to my presentation, really I see the clear added value of the landscape approach is more of a mindset, more of a frame of thinking that can creatively and open up our sectoral approaches. So it is a little bit of both, and I actually think that is the way it should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we can keep on and thinking, about these sustainable development goals. They're working on them right now. They are prepared for, they will have another meeting in September. And if we look into these goals, thinking about poverty reduction, etc., and how it could be interlinked with the landscape approach. What are your comments considering this? And then I would like Ola to start to comment on this. Thank you.
I think my responsibility working at Sida is to make sure that whatever we work and whatever we support from Sida has to have the poor and marginalized groups of people that we are working for in focus. And for many years we have had an approach called Livelihoods Approach to this, looking at what conditions, what pros and cons are there for these people in order to assist them in developing their situation. And I think this landscape approach is very similar in that approach. And in order for us to eventually be able to reach the target of the SDGs, I think we need to take this bottom-up approach to see how can we assist these people in a development perspective for them to reach whatever targets are set under the SDGs. So I think it's a very important tool to achieve the target of the SDGs. So it's not really something you can compare, it's rather a tool and a target, where landscape approach is a very important tool to reach it.
And how do you consider how should it be operationalized then? Should it be by indicators or
Well, I think one has to keep in mind that this is a holistic approach, and we need to weigh in the different conditions or the different preconditions that weigh in for that person, for that farmer, or for that community that live in this landscape. So it's a difficult process, of course. It's a lot of sort of juggling with balls and understanding. But I think the important thing is here to understand the local conditions in order to be able to assist these people to develop.
Okay, thank you for this answer. Lennart, what is your comment regarding this issue, please?
Well, I tend to agree with what has been said, but let me elaborate a bit. I think that the landscape approaches is a very important concept. It's holistic, so it gives you the full picture of the challenges, but it's complex and multifaceted, and thus difficult to deal with, as been illustrated here today. And so I think when you operationalize part of it, you do it. Is it working?
It's working.
Okay, thank you. With within sectors or with combination of sectors. And of course, one key issue then is what you monitor, what you report, what are the indicators for success, because ultimately what you choose to bring out as result from a process of work is what ultimately will be very important in guiding you. And so the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, will be very important, drawing on the success of the Millennium Development Goals. So they will generate goals and sub-goals, and more importantly, indicators. They're not there yet, they're being negotiated. But once you have indicators, they will, or may, we don't know, but if it will be successful, it will then bring out results in relation to those indicators, and that will be a very much a defining feature of what will be the priorities. So I think that is very important. And it's, I add one thing on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's very important to realize that in relation to the Millennium Development Goals, there are two main new features. One is that they're universal. So the 17 goals that we're talking about that probably will be adopted in September are universal, and several of those are very relevant also for Sweden. Not Sweden assisting developing countries, but Sweden developing as Sweden and as a partner in the world to other countries. So that's important. The other one is, of course, that you're finally merging what Sweden tried to do already in 1972 when we organized the first conference in Stockholm on the environment and development. The theme was environment and development, very clearly articulated in the successive conference in Rio in 1992. But here, the Sustainable Development Goals, by name and by formulation, tried to bring the poverty reduction agenda and the sustainability agenda together in one set of comprehensive but hopefully consistent goals. So if they become as important as the Millennium Development Goals have become, then they become, and the sub-goals and the indicators, a key metric globally for measuring success. And if you're in there, you have a focus on your issues. If you're not in there, it's tougher.
So this could really be a powerful tool to push the landscape approach forward and bring investors to invest in a landscape approach.
Well, it could be one element in the picture. There are many other key facts or factors generating economic investments. But if they are as monitored and reported on comprehensively, they could play a role, yes.
Thank you for this. What about Liz? What is your opinion in this?
Well, a lot of my thoughts very much echo the previous two comments there. I think that the landscape approach is certainly complementary to the Sustainable Development Goals. The fact that it, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, there's so many overlaps between the sentiments of and objectives of what the landscape approach framework is hoping to achieve, and it really does direct many of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's certainly a nice cohesion of the landscape approach framework being able to be employed as one of the many tools to address the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't have any more to add. I think they've summed it up nicely.
And you also presented this during your speech earlier today. Thank you. The next question consider the most important criteria for success regarding the landscape approach. I would like you to put forward one factor that you consider to be the most important factor for a successful operationalization and implementation in the South, considering the population growth, the competition between food, fiber, and fuel, etc. So, and you have about 2 minutes comments per person, and then I would like to Jan to start to comment upon this, please.
That sounded like an easy one, and you said only one factor.
Yes.
Only one factor, well, which to choose? I have listed a couple of
yeah,
them.
you can present
but let's say that maybe always at the very top of my list, I have the political will. Either you have it or you have to mobilize it. If you don't get it there, then you won't succeed with anything. But of course, then you have the capacity problem in most of the countries that we talk about. capacity for land use planning and preparation of policy decisions regarding land use. You have the problem of resource mobilization back home for your domestic budget and among the donors, and to match these two and to look into a good solution so that there can be a long-term cooperation and not only a short-term issue at the end of the day. The cost of poverty, poverty mitigation, and need for subsistence, poverty alleviation, those are of course linked with the resource mobilization, and I think then I
governance and capacity building.
Governance and capacity building.
Okay, very good. Ola, would you like to comment upon this one as well, please?
Okay. I think maybe I have two.
Yes, you're
but they are a
welcome.
bit interlinked actually, so one could maybe with some...
we are talking about multifunctional criteria,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
you're welcome.
I think one, and this links a bit to what Jan said here. I think also the political will is very important. But I'd like to add one aspect, and that is the market failures in many African countries where you have big urban populations that are fed by political decision by imported food. To a large extent due to that those in political power want to sort of make sure that the urban population are happy and content. If you have social disturbances in cities, you have a big problem. If you have social disturbances at rural areas, it's much easier to handle. So a lot of market failures, I think, is due to this, that proper care has not been taken into establishing this link between urban and rural interaction. And I think one important thing to solve is to sort of sort out these market failures. And one way could be through possibly having this rapidly increasing urban population and urban middle class who are starting to demand not only quantity but also quality, certified food, safe food, to have and locally produced food, to have that produced locally close by. And if we could harness that consumer power, I think that could be quite an interesting way of solving this problem. Linked to that, I would also like to say it's important whenever we talk about this work in the South, we tend to talk about this rural population as a homogeneous group with similar conditions, similar potential and circumstances and so on. And I think that it's a big risk by doing that. We have a wide span of people who basically are in need of strong, robust social schemes, all the way to people who have a potential to rather soon grow into commercial production, be it in agriculture or any other production. So I think it's important when working with landscape approach, rural development, to make sure that we know who we are working with, what are their conditions, what are their potential, and so on.
So tenure and trade barriers?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Björn, now it's your turn to present yourself for the audience.
Yeah, thanks.
Again.
Ola said much of what I would stress also, but I would go even a step further and say that the landscape approach, in the sense that we impose through NGO-led or international-led thing coming from above, descending upon a landscape, creating stakeholder groups and so on, I think is the wrong way. I think that the right way to start with its application is to identify in any particular landscape, however you define it, define the developmental and the economic potentials in that landscape. And then the basic goal of the landscape approach is to see how you can enhance and promote that economic potential while at the same time finding mechanisms and measures to guarantee other services and functions of that landscape. Let me mention two examples, recent examples. They are related to what Ola said about the differences of small-scale farmers around, in my case, Africa and East Africa in particular. One advantage of having worked for 46 years in the same region is that you see dynamics, you see changes, you see what is happening. thinks that if you're only away for 5 years, you don't capture these things. I was last year, half a year ago, I was in Addis Ababa on a governing council meeting with an African Forest Forum. And I realized the absolutely explosive dynamics in the building sector in Addis Ababa today. And I saw hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of eucalyptus scaffolding poles being grown by small farmers in a circle of about 100 kilometers around Addis Ababa, transported to the town and used in the construction business. Each of those poles were paid by $250, and there were millions of them. And there are tens of thousands of small-scale farmers who earn money on that. The same with the charcoal markets for these growing cities and so on. And instead of calling that a problem, which many people in NGOs and others do, they say this is horrible, and governments say we must forbid it and so on. It's ridiculous. It's an enormous potential. Let the landscape approach be a holistic way of seeing how can you enhance these potentials and how can you prevent enhancing these potentials from having too many negative effects on other functions in the landscape. I could mention many examples related to food production also. I mean, all the greenhouses coming up around Nairobi nowadays where small farms are growing tomatoes for the urban population, earning a lot of money on that. So thank you. Starting with the economic potentials, that is my point.
Very good, very clear. Okay, thank you for this. Let's go over to the very core of this, the success of the landscape approach. And that is, we've been talking about this, Sten mentioned it, and most of the speakers has been talking about if it should get institutionalized or not. And I would like to get a couple of comments from you, if you think it should or not. If yes, what are the reasons? Mia, would you like to start, please?
Yes, you only want the reasons if we say yes, so I say no.
You're welcome.
Yeah, no, I think I was pretty clear, I hope, in my talk. I think we have a lot of institutions already, and the point, to, at least as a first step, I would like to add, to be a bit maybe nuanced in my so clear message of no. Let's start to try to work with the institutions that we have in more applying, opening up, moving a bit out of our comfort zone was a message in my talk, to try to apply the landscape approach. And then let's see, and learn what we learn from that. And perhaps we need to develop new institutions, but I think the first step is start to use the landscape approach more in our sectoral institutions. Thank you.
Does that mean that we should use the tools we have today or develop new tools? What is your opinion about that?
What do you mean by specific tools? The only tools we talked about now has been more of the indicators, and I think I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the tools here. So.
You said we should work with the institutions that we have today, and today you do have some tools for planning, monitoring, etc. And like the forestry sector has come quite far.
Yeah,
I think the right way is to keep on working with these tools, develop them.
Well, I think certainly one of the things that I put on the board there is that I think it's the strength of the sector is this monitoring, assessment and reporting, but I also see that the weakness is perhaps on the social side. So we need, of course, to use those sets of tools that we have, but strengthen them and develop them further in those areas where we are weak today. And perhaps the landscape approach is a way of identifying those weaknesses and then trying to correct them.
Very good. What is Björn's opinion about this?
It doesn't differ too much from what Mia said here. I think the idea of creating some kind of mega institution that handles all aspects of the landscape from the analytical side of it, which is not too problematic, but from to the implementation side of everything that needs to be done in a landscape among all the land uses there. I think, and the policies that are required to push this up or to support this. I don't think that is a realistic way forward. But there is no doubt, of course, that however you define the current sectoral institutional setup, there must be mechanisms created through which they can work together in a much more shall we say, executive way, not only in a informative consultation way, but there must be some kind of executive mechanism by which analysis can be made by a multi-institutional mechanism and so on. I don't want to mention the old Indian example of the planning commission, because I think that is not necessarily what I mean. It's not a communist type of but a multi-sectoral mechanism that can handle these things. That would be my view of it.
Okay, yeah, please. Yes, you're welcome.
It's just one short comment. I think using the word institutions here, it's a bit, because I think Cecilia, for example, meant a totally different thing with institutions, and I think that the word in English it's not equal to the Swedish ones. So I think maybe Cecilia should answer this, but she referred also to what you're referring to as mechanisms now. We don't have to have new buildings, new civil servants, but yeah.
Yeah, we are talking about formal and informal institutions. So different type of groupings of stakeholders, etc. That's also an example of an institution. And these type of executive mechanisms that Björn is talking about, that's also one type of institution, actually. Lennart, do you have a comment on this, please?
Yes, I think landscape approaches illustrate something that we face in many parts of society, namely the need, the growing understanding leading to the need to see holistically, to see a whole picture. At the same time, we're structured as a society very often like silos, like sectors, be it government departments, be it how universities train and educate people, etc. So what we need is to find a way, and as Björn was alluding to find a way to coordinate but all various sectors, but also integrate a bigger picture, the whole, in this case, the landscape approaches, in sectors that work within their frame of reference. It's not about creating a new mega organization, as Björn was saying, but how to not only capture conceptually the holistic concept, but how to operationalize it within a structure that is and will be sector-based, but that has to work together. And this is a challenge that is not specific to landscape approaches. We, any issue now you talk with in government, normally the way you define an issue is much broader than the organizational setup, and thus this is a broad challenge. And I think it has to permeate how you take decisions and how you move things forward, but also how you train and how you develop within institutions of learning, such as this one, because it's a general challenge.
What is your comment regarding trade barriers, etc., when it comes to landscape approach and the importance of handling these challenges? Trade
is a growing issue in terms of impact in landscape, is definitely, because trade is increasing, and trade based on raw materials or natural resources is growing, so it's a factor. But I would like to add maybe one thing to what was said of key factors, and I liked very much once again what Björn said about start with the local, but you also have to bring in all the stakeholders. As someone was saying, many of the stakeholders in a landscape use are non-resident. They are urban dwellers, depending on food, etc. So how do you bring a multitude of stakeholders together? Well, you do it through a political system that is legitimate, that is representative, that's effective, that's accountable. So you have to have a system of taking decisions which bring in all the stakeholders. And so that's, of course, part of a general development, but that is key. Otherwise, the power structure will always keep someone out.
thank you for the answers you've given us. And it's clear that where we are standing right now, the landscape approach really need to develop new tools for implementation and monitoring, etc., to be a useful tool in the future. And now we will open up the floor for the audience for questions. Please.
Okay.
Gentlemen, yes, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the presenters. My name is Solomon. I came from Uppsala University, postdoc researcher. My research area is in Ethiopia. I came from Ethiopia. My question is sort of not a question actually, but I would like, you know, to make some sort of, you know, if the panelists give us some sort of ideas how to tackle the scale issue. I would like to follow up the scale issue because it was, you know, it was indicated that these two land use system and the two sectoral systems, which was given by Liz, is that right? Those two systems are sort of, for me, sort of the minimum or the lower limit of the scale for landscape approach. Now we are in the verge of, you know, when we are saying landscape approach, we are in the verge of, you know, policy implementation or sort of like that. So we need to understand from scale point of view, what is landscape really? I mean, if, okay, the lower limit can be having two land use system, okay. But what is the upper limit? Can we say a continent or a nation or, you know, a landscape? We have seen examples, you know, it's a complex, I can understand that one. There is, you know, when we are, you know, overlapping those all systems, you know, the market system, the agricultural system, we can list of those systems. When we overlap those systems, the scale issue becoming so complex and complex. But still, can we talk in sort of hypothetical way? At least to start with.
To combine with you're talking about the definition of a landscape, and that's connected to the
from
scale.
Scale point
what
of
size
view.
are we talking about here?
Yeah,
so
from scale point of view.
Yeah, from scale point of view. Who would like to answer this question? Lennart, please.
I don't want to answer it. I want to add a question to it because I think it's a very relevant question in relation to your presentation, Liz. I would assume that one answer is that it depends on what dimension of the landscape approach you're looking at, because some dimensions, like tenure laws, are broad, going outside the landscape, and some are smaller in sort of size. So, but it would be interesting to hear you say a bit more about this, Liz, in relation to scale, if it's scale irrespective of what dimension of the landscape approach or not.
Liz, and then John after that.
I think one of the benefits of the landscape approach is that it can be utilised in landscapes of different sizes, and I don't think that there needs to be a maximum size or scale that, you know, dictated on how the approach or framework can be used. I think natural geographical boundaries can often dictate the scale of a landscape, but also administrative limitations within regional and national governments as well can enforce where the limits to a landscape would be considered. So I think it's a difficult question to answer. Thank you for pushing it on to me, Lennart. But I think that's the whole point of the landscape approach framework, is that it's not a single solution that we can apply, but that it's a kind of menu of different options, a kind of a bank of ideas that can be implemented depending on what the requirements of a certain landscape or area needs.
So depending on what type of criteria you're investigating or looking
Yeah,
at,
and
you will
what
decide the
dimension.
size of the landscape after that.
Yeah.
Also, of course, including the stakeholders, etc. And
Yes.
that include cultural aspects and so on. So
Yeah, of course, it's all
Yeah.
part of the landscape.
Jan, please.
I think your question is most relevant because when I tried to prepare myself for making a summary, I had the same question, and I decided if nobody will touch upon it, I have to put it as the question for the future work. Now I went into referencing and found out that there are landscape approaches dealing with millions of hectares. We have, for example, the model forest networks with the examples in several continents. So at least the upper limit that we can talk about is about millions of hectares too. But you can find a lot of references, of course, mentioned here during the seminar also.
Perhaps Mia has some experiences in this area.
Yes, I don't know if this is working or not. Yeah, now it's working. Well, I mean, one clear reference point is the European Landscape Convention, which is perhaps one of the kind of internationally, at least, policy framework that has tried to define what a landscape is. And it talks about an area that is perceived by people, whose character is the result of action and interaction of nature and or human factors. So I think it comes very much to what people perceive or have an identity of a landscape. And me personally, I have worked in very large landscapes. I have worked a lot on cooperation in the Baltic Sea region. And I think that is perceived as a landscape in many ways. It's the whole, all the countries around the Baltic Sea, because that's kind of an identity that brings us together. I've also had worked in cooperation with a cooperation in the Baltic Sea with also the countries around Lake Victoria, because that's also something similar. You have a resource like the Lake Victoria example or the Baltic Sea that connects people from a very large area, so that can be perceived as a landscape. So I think it's very much about bringing back to where you see an identity and how big that scale, and that identity can be very small, but it can also be very large. And as Liz said, you know, perhaps that is a beauty in that. It's what people perceive. But clearly, when you try to manage, you have to have a clear understanding of the people involved. What is the scale that we're actually working on? And I think that's very important. But that needs to be defined among the people who are then trying to manage at the different scales. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's see here. I think I would like to have one final question. And or if you're very short, please.
No, I'd just like to suggest, and I think maybe Anders Malmberg wanted to raise this issue as well, that if we're speaking about scales, it disturbs me a lot. I have big problems with it. But maybe we should pair it with ecosystem services. I mean, at what level do we need a certain service? Because, I mean, I wouldn't be happy if I lived in Kiruna and there was only water in Malmö, for example. That wouldn't be enough for me. I would want water where I am as well. So you have to define on which scale, which kind of service, ecosystem service would have to be distributed. Maybe that would be a way forward for this issue. I don't know.
One comment from the panel about this? I think it was sort of a comment actually, so I think we take it in. Anders is ready to answer that one.
I think the payment of environmental services or ecosystem services is interesting because I stuck my head out for and saying no, and Sten says something different. And here we have a dynamic, I think, which is interesting. And I would just like to comment on that, and that actually connects to Susanne's note. And I would, my problem is where there is not science-based behind a system that you want to imply, then it gets very flimsy. Another problem is I see is the very far away construction of these systems. Of course, there is need incentives for change, for this transformation we're talking about. But the basic environmental services I would go for, which are the provisioning ones, which actually Björn and Ola was talking about. How can we have a society in these countries where the farmers are paid for having a healthy landscape, a more producing landscape that actually capture more carbon and so on, instead of having a system that is global? Try to find the local systems that fill the global needs. And that's my major problem. Of course, payment for environmental services can be parts of the solution, but I see problems when you make them too complicated instead of searching the basics.
The local needs.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for this. One final question, please.
Thank you, Fredrik. It's Lotta Samuelsson from Stockholm International Water Institute again. I'm not at all a landscape approach specialist, but I have attended a couple of landscape events or seminars, and my impression is that even though landscape approaches are meant to be holistic, the dialogue is often about land use management. And not surprisingly, coming from Stockholm International Water Institute, I wonder, where is the water? Anders was talking about the importance of trees and water, and there's been a little bit talk about the Baltic Sea and Lake Victoria, which is good. But I would like to ask you, what is your impression? Is water research and water management, is it included enough, or should it be included more? And if you say no, then I would like to know why.
I would like to put this question to Björn, I think, to start off with.
Me?
Yes, please. You are a soil specialist, etc. You know this.
I only know about trees and forests. No, I think in a way implicit in what Liz and others who are working actively with it is that water is one of the key aspects of the landscape. Obviously, I mean, I don't think there is any attempt to downgrade the importance of water as an integral component, not only as a environmental service, but also as a production component in all its senses. I haven't myself seen enough of the practical applications of landscape approaches to see how water is handled there and how much water expertise takes part in some of these exercises. That remains for Liz maybe to answer. But I would like, since I have, it's always dangerous, Fredrik, to give a floor to me here. Talking
Very
about this,
short, please.
No, yeah, it will be a bit short, but I come back to what I said before in relation to what Susanne said here, and you mentioned just about the scale issue here. I think as long as we keep on saying, when there are questions like that, saying that the scale can vary, and then there's a question, who are the stakeholders? Oh, that can vary, stakeholders can vary. What are the criteria? Oh, they can be many, they can be much. I mean, as long as we have that approach, we as academicians and scientists, we know what we mean. I mean, there is a flexibility we must account for. But when we sell this approach in the future, and I think that's a step forward, which maybe Lennart already thought about saying, we have to have a more concrete definition. Where is the starting point? When we apply the landscape approach, we must have a starting point. We must define, this is a problem we want to solve, this is the opportunity we want to deal with, and these are the limits around that opportunity and or problem, etc., that we want to look at. And then we apply the landscape approach in that. I think it's a starting point that is the key issue here.
Thank you for that. Liz, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out 2 points really. The first one being from the process of the systematic review that we're doing, water is very much included as one of the land use units that we consider to be included in the landscape approach. But from the evidence of the cases is that we found very few landscape approach frameworks included water as well as other land use units. What we were finding there were many, or a few examples where the integrated water management framework was the umbrella concept of the framework, but that was generally water was the primary land use under scrutiny in that project, and didn't really consider other components of the landscape, such as rural communities or forestry or protected areas or anything. So it was very much a single focus case study where water was included.
Thank you very much. There seemed to be a big need for seeing the results from your review. That's quite clear from these discussions. So thank you very much. I would like to thank the panel as well as the audience. And before we ask Jan to make the conclusions of this day, we would like to thank the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mia.